And so that question that starts this chapter off. If marriage is better for women than ever, why do women married to men report lower levels of happiness than men married to women married to women, and single women? So basically, why aren't they happier? Well, a lot of it has to do with the concept of marital roles, and that marital roles are gendered. So marital roles are, what are the behaviors, what are the behavioral expectations associated with being a husband or being a wife? Sometimes you can hear this referred to as wife work or husband work. So, just from our culture, we have picked up messages about what is it that we expect husbands to do and what is it that we expect wives to do. And what's kind of crazy is that even in modern societies where a lot of people are say things like they don't want their parents' marriage, or they're interested in a more egalitarian marriage, or they are feminist or support feminism, oftentimes that wife work and husband work becomes still very gendered. A lot of people still associate housework and childcare with wife work, and paid work with husband work, ignoring the fact, of course, that a lot of women participate in paid work too, which means, what does that mean for that unpaid labor? And so Arlie Hochschild, who is a sociologist, she captured this idea that that there's a growing number of women who, despite working outside of the home, also are still responsible for all of the work inside the home, or the bulk of the work inside of the home. She calls this the second shift. So it's worth noting that if you are a stay-at-home, wife, or mother, or it doesn't necessarily have to be gendered. Of course, when she wrote it at the time, there were very, very few stay-at-home husbands and fathers. But the same applies for them. But if you're a stay-at-home, you don't have a second shift. That unpaid labor, that domestic labor, that is your job. That is your shift. That is your first shift. So this concept was geared towards people who, once again, primarily women, who were working in the labor force. So their paid labor was their first shift, but then oftentimes after getting off work at 5, 6 o'clock, they come home to a second shift, a shift that involves cooking and cleaning and taking care of children, and those types of unpaid domestic labor, things that have to be done. And so part of the kind of reason as to why does this fall more so on the women than the man, if they're both working outside of the home, they're both engaging in paid labor. It has to do with the fact that the home, to the extent that the home itself is gendered, and that there are his and her zones. And this was discussed. This has been discussed previously, but it's that idea that the housework that's traditionally by the women, it usually takes place inside the home, particularly like the kitchen and the laundry room. And the housework, the chores that are associated with husband work are traditionally done outside, or outside of the main living area of the home. So, the garage, the basement, the yard, and the type of work that goes on in his zone versus her zone. That type of work often requires less ongoing time investment. So, car washing, oftentimes in most families, if they are those families are heterosexual partnered families, this is considered to be husband work, and it occurs in his zone. But how often do you really wash your car, or, mow the lawn, or, fix something that's broken? Versus the work that occurs in her zone is usually ongoing. It usually happens daily, if not multiple times a day. And this would be things like cooking, washing the dishes, doing laundry. And so in this way, for women that are responsible for the work in her zone, their second shift demands are much more time consuming, than the second shift demands of their husband, if their husband is only doing the work that is required in his zone. Later, this idea of shifts was expanded to include the third shift, and your book does discuss this. They discuss this in terms of mental load. They don't refer to it in terms of it being a shift, but this is the type of like prep work that in a lot of families is taken on by the woman, researching, what pediatrician to take the children to, and then setting up that appointment. If there is an issue on the internet bill, taking the time to call the internet provider, staying on hold, and then working through that issue. Making plans about, what family members are visiting, or who the family is going to be visiting over the holidays, and organizing those types of vacation details. That work, which is also exists, is more intermittent, but it does exist. And similar to the second shift, a lot of that work does tend to be defined as wife work. So if there are children in the home, it's worth noting that, even without children, um, the second shift can exist. There can be these his or her zones. There's this, gendered distinction between wife work and husband work. But particularly if children exist, the work intensifies, because not only does this add usually additional demands to the housework, right? You're cooking for more people. Some of those people might have really specific requests. All my friends that have children, definitely say laundry increases once you have a child. In terms of the third shift, now you're organizing, doctor's appointments and play dates and schedules and teacher meetings, like your activities. You're doing all of that for multiple, other little small individuals who can't be expected to do it themselves. So, children just increase the amount of work, and then they add some unique types of work, childcare, that weren't an issue, before your family involved children. Before children, you're just bathing yourself. Now, of course, you have to organize baths. So there's that aspect. And so once again, a lot of childcare, even though, this has been one of the shifts that we have seen in contemporary societies, a lot of childcare is still seen as wife work. Your book discusses how mom is the primary parent and dad is at best considered the secondary parent. And you can see that in how, a lot of people think about and talk about family dynamics. You can see it in terms of pop culture references. Even media that is geared towards parents, like, parental like blogs and how-to manuals. A lot of it seems to be assuming that the mom is going to be the primary parent and that the dad is the secondary parent. Some of them go even further and make the dad out to be the reluctant or the incompetent parent, that does things wrong, or is resistant to doing his share of childcare. And of course, the problem with this is twofold. I mean, first of all, is really, it's really cutting dads short, in terms of, expecting them to not be good parents, or having this low bar for them in terms of what it means to be a good parent. And obviously dads can and do better than that low bar in many families. But then the other kind of issue with this depiction of there being a primary and secondary parent is it creates this really high bar for women about what does it take to be a good mother. And, this isn't new. The ideology of intensive mothering, came out of the Victorian era when we first had the beginning of the separate spheres. And it was meant to kind of, address some of the devaluation that was happening of the domestic sphere now that men were leaving the home and going out to work for wages. So it really focused on, the fact that there, needs to be this high bar for, having a good home and raising, good children, and that women should invest all their time and energy into this, and their focus should kind of be on this. But what's crazy is, as I said, that was during the Victorian era. But the fact of the matter is, this still exists today. Today, there is still the ideology of intensive mothering. And your book, when they discuss the ideology of intensive mothering, they say, it's kind of made of three interwoven ideas. The idea that child rearing should include copious amounts of time, energy, and resources, that giving children these things takes priority over all other interests, desires, and demands, and that it should be the mothers who are doing this work. So, it basically genders childcare, as well as puts a very high bar, for what it should involve. And as your book notes, this interrelates with the kind of child rearing ideology of concerted cultivation, which comes out of the work of Annette Lareau, who discusses how, beginning in the 80s and escalating, through recent times, children are seen as like, being special, unique investments, right? And parents are expected to, determine their strengths and talents and cultivate those, with the expectation that they're setting them up for a good and successful middle-class life. And that to be a good parent is to do those things, to, put your child into activities that reflect and build upon their talents and abilities and interests, to encourage your child to learn how to speak up for themselves and to support them in situations where your child needs to be an advocate for themselves to other adults. And that this child rearing ideology is different from the child rearing ideology of the past, which was more what Lareau determined, or what she designated as being natural growth, which is the idea that, you give your child love, you give them, food, clothing, and shelter, but you more or less let them play to be a child. You don't, as an adult, over involve yourself in their lives, and you don't overschedule their lives with activities. And so, up until the 60s, 70s, most children were raised using this natural growth ideology. But like I said, beginning in the 80s, we start to see this distinction where, specifically among middle and upper middle classes, you have the promotion of concerted cultivation, while working classes and working poor and poor families were still more likely to use natural growth. And part of this is because for those middle class, upper middle class families, they're looking ahead to, elite college admissions. And they're wanting to set their child up as early as possible, to be a successful candidate for those types of honors. So, these two ideologies kind of go hand in hand. The practice of intensive mothering, part of why it has lasted today, past the Victorian era that it's rooted in, is because of how closely it aligns with the ideology of concerted cultivation. And so you take those two hand in hand, and you have pretty clear messages coming from the culture about what it means to, raise your child right, and what it requires from the parents, particularly the mom. And so, of course, this does create a double bind for women in a way that it normally doesn't for men, because concerted cultivation and the ideology of intensive mothering, they say that, material resources are important. You should be able to pay to give your child experiences and in a nice lifestyle. But then at the same time, you're expected to spend all of this time with your child, developing their talents and in scheduling them into activities. And so if you're a woman who works, it's a double bind, because you want to be able to, maybe your family needs your income in order to make this type of life possible. But then you would be falling short of that ideology of intensive mothering. And men do not have to worry about this, because there is no ideology of intensive fathering, right? That isn't an expectation. And if anything, men are expected, in fact, that their primary contribution to their family should be providing. And for a long time, that was the very narrow definition of what it meant to be a good husband and father, was to provide. And we discussed this when we discussed, masculinity, in changing definitions of marriage, from chapter 9. But, this put stress on men who weren't able to provide, and it limited men's ability to form close bonds with their children, which, if you, talk to men of older generations, that is oftentimes one of their greatest regrets. So, in today's world, while marriage has this traditionalizing effect on couples, even in self-described egalitarian households, they wind up falling into this rather gendered division of labor. When you talk to people about what they would say they want, whether or not they want to live in a household where the focus is on sharing, paid labor, unpaid labor are equally shared, or do they want to have a household with a specialization focus where, you kind of have a division of labor where one person focuses on paid labor and the other person does the bulk of the unpaid labor. Most couples nowadays say that they want a sharing household. And to some extent, we see this in the sense that a lot of these couples are, in fact, sharing financial responsibilities. That for a lot of couples, both people work full time. But when it comes to domestic labor, the sharing has not been nearly as it hasn't been adopted, nearly as equally. And before we get into this part of the chapter, let's just first put it out there that men today are doing more housework than their predecessors, but significantly less than their wives. And that includes those who are working, those wives who are working full time, right? And your book talks about, to some extent, this might be because housework and childcare is defined as being feminized labor, and that despite the attempts of the intensive ideology of mothering to address that devaluation, it largely has been devalued, and being a homemaker is seen as a loss of status. And that isn't, your book notes that isn't just the case in mixed sex relationships and marriages, but even same-sex marriages. There was this concern that being a homemaker was not a valuable status in society, that people would look down on that decision, and there was concerns that having that position makes a person overly reliant on their partner who is out in the in the workforce. And so what has happened is, one aspect of the household labor has started to become, more shared more equally, and that's the paid labor aspect. While the other aspect of household labor, unpaid labor like housework and childcare, it's not being shared, more equally, or as equally as people at least say that they would like. And lots of different research taken, there's a lot of data and a lot of research on this topic that does exist. And so the data raises two questions. First, if men and women want relationships in which they share paid and unpaid work about equally, why do they specialize in practice? And second, why are women significantly less satisfied with division of labor if men and women are working equally hard? Because, if they say they want to share, but they wind up specializing, why is that? And if they are specializing, and especially if they're specializing in, by choice, then why aren't they equally satisfied with those decisions? Well, your book talks about, there are barriers to equal sharing, some of which are ideological and some of which are institutional. So they introduced the concepts of traditionalist view of marriage, neo-traditionalist view of marriage, and egalitarian view of marriage. The traditionalist view of marriage is, it's pure specialization. It's that division of labor, breadwinner, usually breadwinner father, and then stay at home wife mother. The neo-traditional view of marriage, which was adapted largely, because of the demands of capitalism and increasing costs. What you now have is both people participating in the labor force, but one person, usually the woman, doing the bulk of the second shift, third shift labor as well. So basically all of the work that a stay-at-home mother would do, but it happening after having worked a full shift at their paid job. And then there's the egalitarian view of marriage, which is that, sharing model where paid labor and unpaid domestic labor are shared equally between partners. A lot of people, there are less people, that are interested in the traditionalist view, although of course some do still exist, and it is related. We know from research that this is related to things like political and religious beliefs, and as well as region. So where you live, what political beliefs you have, what religious religion you're a part of, that can shape your support and interest in the traditionalist view of marriage. Neo-traditionalist view, less people go into that type of marriage, wanting that type of marriage. It oftentimes becomes the kind of default fallback, if you will, as perhaps they go into their marriage thinking they're going to do this egalitarian marriage, but what happens is that, they run into barriers around sharing, and they still need both people to remain in the labor force. And so what happens is now you have both people in the labor force, but instead of sharing the household duties, you have one person taking on that. And the authors do talk about this. They talk about how people respond when sharing becomes difficult and impractical, and oftentimes the response in heterosexual marriages is very gendered. It's it is if somebody's going to be the breadwinner, usually men are more likely to have that type of attitude. That if there does need to be an adaptation that takes place to the sharing model, then usually the adaptation is to, instead of making things more equal, is to make things less equal and shared less equally. And of course, she says, for same-sex marriages, they are more likely to adopt and do a better job of adhering to that egalitarian view of marriage. But she does, the authors do note that once children are introduced, that those same-sex marriages can become more traditionalist, neo-traditionalist in setup. And she said that this was more true of marriages between women, particularly when one woman is the biological, mother of the child. So the kind of marriage model, I guess, less likely to fall into that trap, especially once children are introduced, is for men. Marriage between men. Um, but yeah, so there are the ideas in your head that get in the way for sharing, but then there are institutional barriers as well. And so the authors make this great point that both work and family are greedy institutions. They require a lot of your time, energy, and focus. And so what happens is when you have both partners trying to take part equally in both work and family, they very quickly run into problems because, family isn't really set up that way. And then work, which could be set up that way, in our country, it just isn't. And so it pushes families to specialize, even if they didn't want to. And the authors discussed a list of reasons why that push for specialization, why it occurs. Sometimes, people need, they need dual incomes, and they need benefits that are provided by the job. The role of time comes into place. So maybe, both people work, but with commutes, one person has a worse commute. So they have to leave earlier or they get home later. And so that would impact their ability to share equally in the household unpaid labor. There's the role of tax law, that once again kind of like just shapes, whether or not it makes sense for a family, for whether or not it makes sense for both people to work or not. And those laws are constantly changing. To child earned income credits, but there is a income upper limit that's placed on that. And so, these are types of decisions that families, especially once they have children, have to kind of sort out. If both people, do both people want to work? Do both people need to work? Are there some aspects of one person's job that make them more or less able to do more than the other person in regards to housework and childcare? So, these are what would be considered institutional barriers. But work does, in fact, make this worse because they have a lack of family-friendly policies. And so your book talks about, the mommy tax, the fact that, women who take, time off from their careers, even if it's not a lot of time, but they have to take some time off to, have a baby, deliver it. And then, of course, continue to take time off to do things like, take their child to the doctor's appointment. Oftentimes, by taking that time away from work, they are penalized for it. And so, instead of the mommy tax, I often refer to this as the motherhood penalty. Women are, they're paid less money, they receive less promotions, they are placed on the mommy track, which is a track that doesn't lead to, promotions and upper level management, upper level administration, because they're just seen as that they are not ideal workers in the sense that their time is divided between family and work. Now, for some jobs, there is a fatherhood premium. There is the expectation that unlike mothers who will become less committed to their jobs once they have children, that fathers will become more committed because financial security and economic responsibility become a lot more important once you have, dependents who are, vulnerable and dependent on you to make money to take care of them. And so some jobs, tend to pay fathers more because the expectation is they will get more out of them. But there is, similar to the mommy track, there is the possibility, though, that a father who is committed to equal sharing, who is committed to having an active role in their child's life and being there for the teacher work days and the doctor's appointments, there is the possibility that, like the mommy track, that father will be placed on the daddy track, where once again, because they aren't seen as the ideal worker who is prioritizing their job over their family, they are not considered for promotions. They aren't advanced, up the career ladder. They might find that they are, limited or stuck in entry or mid-level positions in a company, because that assumption is, that they are not, prioritizing their job. And just in general, a good example about how specifically in the United States, that we don't have these family-friendly policies is just to consider our maternity and paternity leave. This country has 0 weeks of federally mandated paid maternity leave. Let me say that again, because for some reason, when I teach this in California, students always get hung up. Federally mandated paid maternity leave. Federally mandated means that the federal government requires all states to offer this amount of leave. Paid means your leave is paid, it's not unpaid. So I emphasize that to say there are some jobs that choose to give their employees paid maternity leave. And there are some states that choose to pass policies where women receive paid maternity leave, but there is no federal policy that provides that mandates that, which means if you change jobs or if you leave states, you go to a state that doesn't have that state policy, you are not due that. Right? There is no federal protection. And it's just worth noting that, if you compare us to our neighbors in the North, where federally mandated leave is at 50 weeks, or even our neighbors to the South, where federally mandated paid maternity leave is 12 weeks. And you can see, that there's a range of countries in terms of what they offer. The fact that America offers 0 should really stick out. And another way of looking at this on a global sense is to look at it right here, that that there are only 9 countries that offer 0 weeks of paid maternity leave at the federal level, of which America, is the largest. And you can see that 83 countries offer, at least, somewhere between 0 to 14, that 36 countries, and most of those countries are in fact in Europe, offer 52 weeks or more. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the work chapter. And then what about paid paternity leave? Well, obviously in America, if we have 0 weeks of federally mandated paid maternity leave, obviously we have no paid paternity leave mandates. Once again, this varies by country, with Europe offering more than other countries. So all of this is just to say that, families face some real decisions about how they're going to organize division of labor in their families. That there aren't just that this isn't just an issue in their heads that can be decided upon in their heads, because there really are institutional barriers that influence these decisions. So what do these decisions look like in individual families? So there's 7 ways of arranging family life. And just a heads up, although she talks about all of this in this chapter, how they organize the chapter in this second edition is a little different than how it was organized in the first edition. And I do prefer how it was organized in the first edition. But, the information is all there in the second edition. It's just organized in a different way. But, there are 7 ways of arranging family life that can be discussed. 2 related to specialization, 2 related to sharing, 2 related to self-reliance, and then 1 is childlessness, child-free by choice. And then there's kind of like a murky 8th type that she introduces at the end, basically just talking about, how families can be extended, by not just extended kin who are related by blood, but, fictive kin, in the form of other mothers, other fathers. And then, of course, with the kind of growing acceptance of polyamory in some parts of the country, how that also kind of is extending families. But there wasn't a whole lot of details or supporting research for that type of family, which is why, I just have it as like, an eighth type with a caveat, and I'm not really going to discuss it too much. But let's briefly just hit on the highlights of the 7. So in regards to specialization, there are 2 forms here. There is the modern breadwinner and housewife. This aligns with that kind of traditional marriage model. Your book notes that these families tend to either be wealthier or poor. And that's because if wealthier, it usually means that one person, sometimes it's traditionally it's the man, doesn't have to be, but one person makes enough money in their role as the modern breadwinner to be able to support their family in a comfortable fashion. However, the other type of family that has this model tends to be poor. And it's worth noting that the poorer families are more likely to, for the gender to sometimes to be flipped, where you have a woman breadwinner and a house husband. But in poorer families, it has to do with the fact that especially if you have multiple children, if you aren't making enough money to cover the cost of daycare and you don't have access to free daycare, there really might just be limits on, whether or not it makes sense for both people to be working fairly low paid jobs if they have children in the household that they need to take care of. These poor families that have this type of division of labor, it might also be because one person is either kind of chronically unemployed or underemployed, or that they have health problems or disabilities. And so, in this type of family, you have that breadwinner and then you have the person that's staying at home. And this relates to the family focused strategy that was discussed in chapter 5. And then the other specialization family is related to the neo-traditional type. It's most commonly a neo-traditional dad and a super mom. So what you have here is that both people are working, but that the woman is coming home and doing the bulk of the second shift. And so research suggests that people who have this family type are unhappier and less satisfied than the other types, including the modern breadwinner and housewife. And that's because, having a first shift, second shift, third shift, I mean, you're burning the candles at both ends. Like you're stressed, you don't have a lot of free time for self-care. And so these types of families in particular, run the risk of divorcing and being unhappy, even if they don't divorce. Obviously, like what I said before, this can be differently gendered, that it can be super dads and neo-traditional moms. Although it's worth noting, for ideological as well as institutional reasons, this does tend to be less likely. And this is what the book was talking about when they, were saying, like, that attitude, if someone's going to be the breadwinner, it's going to be me. And just kind of the conception of household labor as being feminized, that it is a rare position for the father in a same-sex marriage to kind of take on this super dad role and be married to a neo-traditional wife. Then there is the sharing aspect, and there are two ways that the book highlights that this can look. One can be what we call the outsourcers. Domestic outsourcing is when, you outsource a lot of the unpaid domestic labor to people that you pay to do it. So this could be like having a housekeeper. This could be like having a food, prep service, hiring a nanny or au pair. And so because you're paying for what you could do for free, obviously the types of families who rely upon this strategy tend to be class privileged couples. And if you want to go back to chapter 5 and the strategy related to this, these are your co-breadwinners. They're both working and they're both working at jobs that usually require a good amount of time, but compensate pretty well. And so they choose to take that, as opposed to, one of them stepping back and specializing. Instead, they choose to take that extra money and they just pay other people to do that type of domestic labor in their home. But a question to consider here is, and so in this way, let me note that this family is more egalitarian, but the question to consider, are we achieving more egalitarian marriages for middle and upper classes at the cost of a more egalitarian society? Because, oftentimes the people that are making their egalitarianism possible are low paid, service workers, domestic workers. And a lot of those domestic workers tend to be women themselves, and they have their own children that they are not able to take care of, and their own homes that they're not able to take care of, because they are working for usually not great wages, in this other person's home. And your book talks about this by emphasizing the role of the care chain, right? Upper class, upper middle class women, who, for gendered reasons, are expected to provide care, for people in their families who require it. And that would be everyone from, like, the elderly who can't take care of themselves, children who can't take care of themselves. If you have any family members who are, like, chronically ill or disabled. And so the expectation is that the women of the family are going to take care of those people. But if they are unable to do so or choose not to do so, and they have the financial resources, they can pay usually other women, to provide that care, and those women that they are paying, to provide that care, domestics and nannies and, CNAs, right? Oftentimes these aren't jobs that, have, the best pay. So this is low wage work. And so then the question is, okay, well then who's providing the care for those women's families? Because it's not like they're making a lot of money. So who's taking care of their children? And usually they're having to rely on extended family or, fictive kin, your other mothers, or they're relying on, their children, older children, looking after their younger children, taking care of themselves. So, it's an interesting question to think about. Your egalitarian family is being predicated upon this, non-egalitarian society. The other kind of way that a family can share in the division of labor, which is much more rare, is to just turn away from work together, which your book calls dual nurturers, where both adults de-emphasize work and focus on raising a child or children. By not, it's right there in the definition. Like, for a lot of these families, you at least have to be financially comfortable, to be able to not focus on work. That means that your basic needs are still being met, because no one is saying that you should turn away from work if that's going to result in you being, like, homeless and your child, going hungry. So oftentimes, similar to the outsourcers, there is a little bit of class privilege at work here with the dual nurturers as well.